Welcome, everybody. Today we're working on Unit 8. Unit 8's topic is functions. Uh, Functions, to just kind of like give you a background in as brief as possible a way, a function is basically a pre-configured block of code that executes certain actions without you needing to write those actions into the code. Now, in uh, MySQL, when we refer to functions, these are not going to be functions that we create from scratch. These are functions that are built into MySQL as a language, and we will simply utilize them to perform certain tasks to kind of ramp up our coding with SQL. It is possible to write things that are sort of akin to functions in regular programming, and those are called stored procedures typically, which is in an upcoming unit, but not this unit. For those that are also taking Python simultaneously with this, and I'm teaching that class later tonight, I did come to the realization that, oh wow, both on Monday and both classes are covering functions, and I'm sorry for the confusion already because there is that potential that you might get slightly confused. The difference with Python, however, is that we will create the functions while here in MySQL, we will utilize functions. Now, some of the functions we've been using all along, and I think this is kind of interesting because I think maybe even the first week we were using some functions, or maybe by the second week or something like that. And I just like told you basically, well, this is a function and just do what I'm doing and follow along and it'll work, right? But now we're going to take a little bit deeper dive and look at functions. I'm also going to kind of like show you that there's like a rich library of functions in different categories. My intent is not to talk about and lecture on all those because it's really like a little bit too deep to do that. Both of the websites that we use as reference, W3 Schools and the MySQL tutorial site, both have a lot of really good materials on this. The MySQL tutorial site also has materials that talk about MySQL regular expressions and functions related to those. And so we're going to, at the end of this lecture, we're going to talk about that as a concept. I've been kind of wrestling with the thought of maybe giving you maybe a super brief primer on regular expressions without kind of, taking it too far. We'll get there by the end of the lecture portion. The lecture should not take too long here today, and you'll see why as we kind of press forward. All right, let's jump over to W3 Schools in my Brave browser here. I do have W3 already opened up. For those that are unaware of this as a web browser, I'm gonna within the Brave browser search for the Brave browser. But I think this is kind of interesting because a lot of people, I do throw this up on screen and talk about it, but then I realize I never explain what it is or where it comes from or why I'm using it. The Brave browser is basically a clone of the Chrome browser. It uses the same code base. It's not the only browser that does that, by the way. Edge uses the same code base. Safari uses the same code base if you're on a Mac. Of course, Chrome uses that code base. And there's actually many others. But Brave is basically under the hood is Chrome. However, they do things to the browser that make it kind of unique. And as you read like the stuff that's on the screen right now, it basically, I think of it as sort of like a privacy anti-tracking browser is really kind of a good way to put it. With a lot of browsers that you get, like Chrome, a lot of us have this tendency. It's like, well, I'm going to put a pop-up blocker on. I'm going to put an ad blocker on. Oh, there's this anti-tracking thing. And, Google's whole business, by the way, is tracking all the stuff you do. And I was having a discussion with some people over the weekend about this, that when you're like scrolling through Facebook and you just pause for a second over somebody's posting, they figure that you like that. whatever that happens to be. And then they share that with their third-party advertisers. And it's really tricky to turn that stuff off in that browser, by the way. So Brave is a tool, basically as a browser that out of the box, and oh, I'm already in there. For example, as I'm like sitting here, it runs what it calls like all these shields, right? And you can see I don't even have all of them turned on, but just since I've been on the browser, it's already blocked 5 trackers, right? And I think this is pretty interesting, right? It just does it out of the box. You don't have to add plugins or anything like that. Um, and so it's recommended, and a lot of people who work in the industry tend to use this browser just because of the features, right? And they don't have to like go getting plugins and whatnot. Another browser of note that does a lot of these things in kind of similar ways, Firefox does a lot of this stuff too, but you have to trigger it on or get plugins or a combo. So that works pretty well. This one also has kind of an interesting scheme where you can opt in on ads. And they have this little rewards panel. And so like you can choose to view ads and then they give you tokens for it. And then you can use the tokens to buy stuff from their advertisers. It's a really weird scheme. I once saw like this weird like sci-fi show on Netflix. I for the life of me don't remember the title of it, where some lady needed to like go across the country on a train or something to go to a funeral, but she didn't have any money. So she went to the train station and they were like, with ads or without, right? And she said, well, with ads, I don't have any money. So the whole time she was on the train going across the country, there was somebody sitting next to her reading ads to her, right? And that's kind of how I equate the internet experience when you're online sometimes, is they just bombard you with ads. So like if you are really tired of that and you're tired of tracking or whatever, this is really kind of a cool browser to check out. So just plugging it a little bit. It's not the only one out there. Yes, it works on phones, but I'm just kind of pointing it out. All right, let's talk about functions now. And once again, in this language, we are not going to be creating the functions, but it does mention here that MySQL has a lot of built-in functions. It certainly does. And what we see listed on the page here is, I'm just telling you up front, is not the complete reference of all the functions that are available. It is the most important ones or the ones that are most commonly used. And we are not going to use all of them here in class. I am going to focus on the ones I know we're going to use. And I did make a list earlier, so I remembered to talk about all the important ones or ones I think are important for our assignment. So I got that list up on my other screen here. All right. The functions in essence are really pre-written programming routines that are built into the SQL programming language that we refer to by name. Usually we call them by name, we put a set of parentheses after them, and sometimes we put stuff inside the parentheses and sometimes we don't. Most of the times we do. And then that gets something special to happen with the code, right? That we otherwise would not be able to use. So for example, early in the course, we learned how to do a concat, right? Where we are joining pieces of string together, right? And then up, like dropping that into one column together. For example, you could take first name and last name, add a space in between, and then join those together and put them in another column, right? Because it just looks nice. Another one that we've used is the round function, where we take a decimal number and we maybe round it to like 2 decimal places, so it looks like a money format, that type of thing. They do break down their functions into a bunch of different categories, and you can see on the left sidebar here, I was like scrolling through them, and you'll notice that the functions basically fall into these categories. Functions related to strings, so text basically, right? And there's a big list of them. Functions related to numbers, also quite a list of them. Functions related to dates and times, quite a list there as well. And then they have what they call advanced functions, which do, let's call it higher end things. We've played with some of these already too. And Some of these are very, very powerful, by the way, and some of them we will learn about in subsequent units as we move forward. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the string functions up here at the top, and I'm just going to hit some of the key ones. We'll look at some of the syntax for them, how they work. But then as we're looking at this big list on the screen, I just want you to keep in mind, like if you're thinking about working on a database and you have this thing you want to do, but you're not sure how to do it, there's a really good chance that there's a function already written that might help you accomplish that task. And it's good to know that there's references out there. And really, I think the two websites that we point you to, which is, excuse me, W3 Schools and MySQL Tutorial, both are really excellent reference sites for being able to look stuff up. The other place, of course, where you can look stuff up is on the MySQL website directly. All right, so let's start taking a look at some of these. And I'm not going to start at the top of the list because they have them alphabetized. And I will tell you that just because it's the top of the list doesn't mean that's necessarily something you are going to use. I'm going to point out first one that we already have used just to kind of trip your trigger on like the functionality of a function. So here, for example, is an example of the concatenation function. And this is one that we use pretty early on. Concat, of course, stands for concatenation, which in programming refers to joining strings together. And in this case, they're using examples of literal strings, meaning they're actually typing in the text, putting in a comma, typing in some text, putting in a comma, typing in some text, putting in a comma, and then it will output as one output. But there's kind of an anatomy to this, and this is really more the important part for today's session. Is this thought, right, that this is the function name. The function is followed by a set of parentheses. And as I told you before, sometimes we put stuff in there, sometimes we don't, usually we do. And then inside here, we are passing values to the function, right? And in this case, these are literal strings, and I'm trying my best to draw with my mouse. And then those values are separated by commas, right? So that's kind of the anatomy of it. Pretty normal, right? In programming, when we are sending values to a function, we call that passing parameters, right? We're sending values to it. The function will receive those as separate pieces of information and then do whatever it's supposed to do with them, right? And what you send into a function, well, it depends on the function, right? I mean, it depends on what the function does. In this case, the function joins strings together. And yeah, I mean, if your brain said, couldn't I just take the string and pre-join it? Yeah, you totally could, right? This is not a really good example. But what you could do is like the one that I was describing, where you can concatenate, let's say, a last name or a first name and a last name together, put a space in between, and put it together into one column, which might be useful for doing other tasks in your database. Like if somebody logs into your website, for example, and you put their name on the screen, like, welcome, Joe Smith, you know, that type of thing. So function call, a set of parentheses, values are separated by commas, right? Those are called parameters. The function performs some sort of an action, and whatever action it performs would execute inside the other code, right in this spot, before the other code executes. So like if there's a function in your SQL code, that executes first. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is it's possible to take one function and put it inside of another one. If you do that, the one on the inside executes first, then the one on the outside executes after, then your SQL code executes. That's kind of the procedural aspect of it. So it's kind of from the inside out, right? And I think these are important things to know. I'm not going to demo this one. I think we've tried this one before, so it really isn't that big. But notice once again, they show the syntax, right? And with Concat, basically, this one can take as many expressions as you can throw at it. This is not a fixed number of parameters on the inbound. So if I have like 50 strings to join together, this could do it, right? And notice that they don't necessarily have a string here. They say an expression because this could be SQL code also. But, right, and this is why you look stuff up when you run functions. It says if any of the expressions is a null value, the whole thing will return null and it won't work. So you got to also kind of know your data. The other thing that they do with these functions is they'll show you like this little chart here. For example, like which version of MySQL it works with. So if you're working with legacy code, let's say you're working with MySQL 3.0, this won't work. Okay, what version of MySQL are we on? You guys remember? Yeah. If you don't, it's not a bad thing to know. We're working with version 8, right? So this has been around for a while, basically. They do have some, I think, better examples here. Like, I think this is a better example of concat, for example, where we're concatenating, in this case, a column, right? Or a column, this is a column name, not text. So whatever's in these columns, right? And then, so we're going to take the address, we're going to put a space after it, we'll put the postal code in, then we'll put a space after it, and then we'll do a city. And that is kind of logical, right? Like if you're looking like, okay, where's the address, zip code, and city of, the people on this table? And then you could output it all into one column and join it together. So this is, I think, a much better example. Now, if we go back to that list, now you can start to look at some of these others and go, okay, well, if that's how that one works, what are other ones that might be useful for me? All right, so what if I wanted to know how long a string is? Now, in this case, once again, this first example, this is a hard-coded string. I could just look at it and count, right? Like how many characters are in that string. However, if I'm looking at information in a database, I might like have to go find it. I might have to run a query to get to it and then count the characters. That's very cumbersome. So this one is kind of useful. So if you, for some reason, need to know how long a string is somewhere in one of your tables, this is the function you would use. And I would think that they have probably a better example here, like, character length of customer name. Like maybe you don't remember the customer name, but I know it was 5 letters, something goofy like that. So you could get that kind of response. I'm not going to run this. This is pretty easy to run on your own. I'm just kind of pointing out some that might be helpful. Here's another one that's kind of helpful, is the formatting command. And I do think that this one's quite useful because a lot of times when we're working with, especially with large numbers in a database, right? Like for example, look at how large that number is. And when you look at it, it's really kind of hard to read and say, well, that's 250,500.5634. And what the format command will do is it will take that number and insert commas, right? Like we were taught as children to do, right? For thousands and millions and whatever. And then also, if you add a second parameter, it will round it to that many decimal places and just display that many decimal places. So you could see why that would be useful, especially if you're dealing with very large monetary amounts. If you don't want to show a decimal place, you can, get rid of the 0. And yes, it can handle pretty large numbers. So I think that this is a pretty useful one, right? Especially when you're dealing with money and you want to be able to read it nice and clearly. Right, so that's a good one to use. All right, I'm looking at some of the other ones I have on my list here. All right, so we had character length before. I want you to notice that some of these, there's another one that's just a length function. Here's ones that kind of mimic some of the things that we see in like Python, for example, where like this one, if I want to take a string and turn it into all lowercase for some reason, or as you can imagine, if there's a lower, there's probably an upper, right? So there's another one that will convert stuff to uppercase. So those are pretty good. Um, Here's kind of a weird one that we've used. I guess that's a numeric one. All right. How about this one here? I think this is a really good one. Um, Locates one that allows you to look for a piece of text inside a bigger piece of text. All right, and I'll have you like ponder this for a second. Like when you sit down at Google, right, and you type in a search and you press enter, how does it find it exactly? You guys ever think about that? Do you think it like right at that moment goes out to the internet and starts looking over the internet to find the content? I assure you that's not how it works. Search companies like Google will go out and crawl the web, gather all the information, store it in a database, so then when you run a query on their website for, let's say, a phrase, then it looks in their database for that phrase amongst bigger blocks of text. So this is kind of how they do it, right? You know, this sort of technique. So this will allow us then to basically search for a very particular piece of text inside a larger body of text. Now, in this case, the text that we're searching within is hard-coded, not really a great example. However, if you were to do it with a column, right? Like, so if I'm looking for a customer name and like, okay, so maybe it was like, I don't know, it was kind of like blacksmith, but I don't remember what kind of smith it was, but there's certainly Smith in the title, right? You could locate Smith inside your customer name, and then it would come back with the result, right? So it allows you to basically search for a very particular snippet of text within a column. I'm going to actually run this one just so you can kind of see what it does, right? So this finds the letter A, right? So anything that's got a letter A in it is going to come back as a result. That's kind of not really a great one. But let's just say, for example, I was looking for the word horn, right? I want you to notice here, if I put in horn and then search for that, will it pull back a result? Did it work? It it's kind of questionable that it worked, actually, right? I did hit the run button. At least I think I hit the run button. And maybe I need to refresh it. Let's refresh it. Okay. All right, now I'll hit the run button. Let's see if it loads. No, it's still notice that it's still pulling the same query. So let me just try this again. Let me see if I can trigger it. Okay. So according to this, it's working. I'm questioning whether it's working or not. I don't. So this is not turning out to be a great example because it has just as many results. Now, I'm noticing that around the horn is spelled with a capital H, not a lowercase h. You guys picking up on that? And I'm not really sure that it's running correctly because we're doing it in browser, and I'm not sure that it's loading properly. So let's try it like this. Hoping the spinning wheel stops. Run. All right, it's still giving me the same results. So I'm questioning whether or not it's going to work. Now, okay, so maybe it actually is working, and I'm just not seeing it. Because notice the results. I guess I wasn't seeing this before. You notice that it's not there, not there, not there. So it's giving me zeros, but where it is appearing, right, I'm getting like a thing. Now, why is it giving me the number 12? Okay, so here's what it's doing. It's finding the name, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. That's where it starts. So the 12 is telling me it's starting in position 12 of this particular entry. I think it's interesting because I'm looking at the query, right? It is selecting all the customer names, regardless of whether or not it's in there. The second column is locating where that string starts. So not only is it finding it, but it's finding its location. So before, when it had the letter A in here, right? And let's just try a different letter like T, right? And I run that, it's going to find the letter T and then give me the location of the first occurrence of the letter T in that string. I think that's kind of interesting. Kind of very granular, right? Okay, so like now you got to think to yourself, why on earth would I ever use this, right? And there might be some functional reason that you can't imagine right now that somebody else is like, hey, like, we need, all the names with the letter T in this spot. So kind of a weird one. I want you to notice that sometimes they make these little notes in here that we just use locate, but you can also use position interchangeably with it. So sometimes there's two function names. I'm not sure why that happens, and I think that's part of the evolution of the language or the fact that MySQL is attempting to use syntax from other languages within it. So I'm not really sure of the history of that. Another one that's useful with strings is this one here called substring. I'm going to bring that one up on the screen. So the point of this one is to extract a substring from a string, start at position 5, extract 3 characters. So this is kind of weird. So that means I can go into text I have in a column and then drill down and give it a starting point and then pull a certain number of letters out and just use that. I can't think of an example offhand that might be useful for, or here's an example that might work. How about if your phone numbers are stored as text, which I always recommend, by the way, in the database, not numbers. And I just wanted to extract the area code. I could have it skip the first parenthesis, right? Grab the next 3 characters and just look at that. And then I could pull that back as a result, and I would have a list of area codes. You guys feel where I'm going with that. So for this example, let's just run this one here, right? So from the customer name column, they're going to start at position 2 and extract 5 characters. So let's just run it and see what happens. Yeah, that's kind of weird. Right, because I don't know what the actual customer names are, so that's not included in there. Here's how you could figure it out, though. You could actually add here customer name as a return, because that way you would see what it is, and then you would see the extraction. So start at position 2, 1, 2, right? And then pull out 5 characters. All right, so we're at 2. And then what are we pulling out? L, F, R, E, D, right? Is that what we have? Yes. Okay, that's kind of weird too, isn't it? It's a little weird. But the fact that you can go in there and do that kind of stuff is kind of interesting, actually. So you could get to very specific pieces of information. What we're pulling out is what they call a substring because it's part of a string. All right. Weird function. Can't think of a usage for it in my head right now, but I'm sure there's a reason. And I know our homework's got at least one of those in there to play with. What's also kind of interesting, for all we know about substrings and index numbers. Okay, so here's another point of confusion between Python and SQL, right? In Python, when we look at position numbers of letters, what number do we start counting with? Yeah. And then here we are in SQL, and what number did we start counting with? Yeah. Welcome to SQL, right? So you got to keep that straight in your head. And of course, if it doesn't work the way you expect, you just adjust your code. but that's how it works in SQL. I don't know why they didn't have a zero starting point. Um, Fascinating for sure. Here's another weird command. I don't think we're using any of these, but this is um, kind of a thing that, like, when we do programming, we'll talk about this in the Python class too, ironically, is when you're interfacing with a user on a screen, right? Especially a user that's been on the screen all day, right? Typing, pressing enter, moving the mouse around, clicking on forms, filling out information, you get into this like flow where you're typing a lot, right? And think of how you type. I type a word, and every time I type a word, I hit space in between, right? So it's not unusual as people are typing stuff into forms online or on an app or whatever. Sometimes they add a space before it or space after it, and then they hit enter, click the button, and now the space is captured, not realizing that that actually counts in programming, right? And so both on a programming standpoint, so if you're in a language like Python, you can write commands that remove those. That's a real common thing to do. But database people also can do it. So for example, they might receive input from a user that might have superfluous spaces at the beginning and end. And the trim command allows you to go in and just remove those. So like if you run that, right, you'll notice, well, I guess you don't see them removed, but you have to take it on faith, right? Because when they're gone, you don't see them. But that command can be pretty useful too, right? So you can do that to information that's already in a database. Um, and let's see here. I think that most of this stuff is pretty self-explanatory just by looking at the names of it. I'm just kind of pointing that out. They have like really weird ones. Do you need to reverse the letters that are in a column? I don't know. Why would you ever want to do that? But you can do it. Maybe there's a reason. I'm not really sure what the reason is. But they have really weird functions like this. And this is another explanation of why I don't go through each one and show you how it works. Um, Most of the ones that we're concerned with from the string section, we've already covered. And then if I missed one, we can always come back and look at the definition. Let's now move down to the numeric ones. And I think it's probably better to approach it from here. Now, numeric ones are maybe a little bit more normal, at least in scope, because like think even with Python, right? Like when we're coding in that language, like if you want to do a square root, right? You have to call in a math library, and then you call one of its functions, and then that does the work to give you, the formula that you need, so you don't have to type it in yourself. Or there's like a min and a max function, those types of things. So as you kind of scroll through this list, um, look at some of the things you can do. I'm not going to go into each one and demonstrate, obviously, but if you wanted to get the absolute value or the arc cosine or an average, this one we've played with, right? Average is one that we've played with already. Ceiling, the smallest integer value that is greater than or equal to a number. That's kind of interesting. Cosine. Here's another one that we've used, the count. That's a very useful one, by the way. Used for integer division. That's kind of interesting. I would just use an operator for that, but apparently you can use a keyword too. If you want to raise something to a certain exponent, you can use the exponent function. Greatest, least, that's kind of like a min and a max. You can do logarithms, base 10, base 2, a max and a min function. Notice they have a mod here. So like for the modulus operator in place of it. They also have a function for pi, for various powers. Here's another interesting one, right? So, in traditional programming, if we want to get a random number, we have to use a random number generator, which is usually a custom function of some sort from a library. Here, the random function is built in. It's just called rand. This is one that might be useful. Not using it on our homework today. But notice that basically And this is kind of weird because you can run it just like this. And here's an example of one with empty parentheses. And I just hit the button and it gives me some random value. I do want you to notice that it's a decimal value. Isn't that weird? Why not a whole number? Well, there's more precision on the decimal side of things is part of the answer. You can also feed in a seed value on these. So I can put in, like we do in Python often, number 42, and you see how it changes it. But in principle, every time you run this, you should get a different value. But I think you have to change your seed number to get a different value because it gives it a different starting point. All right. Once again, use case specific is a good way to put it, right? Like I can't think of an example for it right now. One that we've used a lot is the rounding function. I think that in combination with the format function, like when you like format numbers, right, with the commas, the rounding function, could be used sort of in place of that. We've done quite a bit of that. The real common one to do is what we see here, where we often round to 2 decimal places for currency. Very, very, very common. Trying to think of any other ones here. Say you can do sums and sines and cosines and all that. And this truncate one's kind of interesting too. Truncates a number to the specified number of decimal places. This is, I would call a special use case. Also, kind of sort of does what the round function does, if you see what I mean. And so, I would probably use the round function myself rather than truncate. And actually, that's not true. I think round actually raises the value of a digit where truncate just cuts it off. So actually, there is a difference. All right, let's quickly look at some of the date functions. Some of these are kind of useful. If you remember dates in MySQL, oops, and I didn't mean to do that here. I meant to do that up here. So I apologize. I was just making a new tab in my Notepad++. But if you remember, like dates inside MySQL are year, month, day, right? And then space, and then we have like hours, minutes, and seconds, right? Kind of like that. That's how the information is organized. Now, that's not always super useful, by the way, for like putting it out on screen. Europeans want to see it one way, Americans want to see it a different way. Whatever, and one of the things that we often do with dates is we just put them into a format that looks nice, right? So like a real common one to use is date format in this area. And notice the command here, folks, and I think we've played with this one a little bit, right? Like if you want to format this and just see the year, notice the special syntax that goes with it. Right, so we have this ability then to put in the special control character and just extract the year out of it. I don't know if you guys remember when we did the exercise a couple of weeks back, we also did it a different way. We basically, I think, converted it to a string and then grabbed only certain characters out of it. That was all done with functions too. The thing that's kind of interesting here is if you do use the date format command, they have a bunch of little control characters that you can use to kind of make your output look the way you want it. This is not something like, for example, that I've ever memorized. Whenever I need to do something, I just go in here and look it up. But I think some of the interesting ones are, like, for example, if you use the letter D, it'll say the day of the month is a numeric value followed by a suffix. So like the first, the second, the third, etc. Right? So that could be kind of cool and useful. Whereas if you use the lowercase d, it just gives you the numeric value, notice with a leading 0 if necessary. Here's like weird stuff like this, like they like actually track microseconds. Yeah, computers do actually store that, but that's not usually written into a database. But maybe if you're doing like scientific work, the microseconds might actually matter, whereas if you're like, just trying to get to school on time, it probably doesn't matter at all. So like you would have to kind of study this table and look at what it brings you. But I think it's really cool. Like, for example, this is one I might use, right? If I use the capital M, it would give me the month name as a word, right? So I could actually have it say December or November or something like that. Yeah, kind of an extensive chart for, something kind of so simple. So date format is the one that is really pretty cool to use. Of course, the date function itself, right? And this is kind of one of the core functions here. So date is a function, time is a function, where you can take snippets of text that somebody might type in or enter on a user form somehow, and then actually convert that into a date in the system. So be mindful of that, right? Like if you had a form, like let's say in an app, and the user types in, okay, give me your date of birth, year, month, day, or whatever format you put it in, you would be capturing it as text, and then you need the function to convert it. So that's why it exists. You're like, well, if it's a date, it's a date in the data type. Why do I need to convert it? Because it might not come in as a date is generally why. Um, you can do some like weird stuff like this too, where you can actually take a date and add, for example, an interval. And here's a really primitive example here. We're going to do, I think, one of these in our code today, where basically we're going to take, notice, June 15th of 2017, right? And we're adding an interval of 10 days. And notice the output becomes 25th. Okay, so why would you use something like this? Maybe you have some sort of a thing where, let's say you're giving one of your users a free trial period on a piece of software. I'm extrapolating here, right? And they signed up for the software on the 15th. It's a 10-day free trial, and then you could drop this into your database. That when does the trial expire? On the 25th, right? You can like calculate it. So if you can add to a date, can you like subtract from a date? Yeah, that you could use the date difference thing. And really what this does, folks, is it looks for the difference in the days. So like if I have June 25th and June 15th, what's the difference? Well, that's 10 days difference, right? So we can figure that out. Now, that's an easy one to look at and figure out. But what if it was like 1 year? And actually that's really kind of a good example, right? Like what if it was like, I don't know, 2019, for example, right? That's one that you probably can't calculate in your head, so you could do it with code, and it's a 740-day difference, that type of thing. And so it's just can be quite useful. I do want you to notice that there's a bunch of different date functions here, and I'm trying to get back to the root page here for dates, right? Remember, like for example, if you want to get a current timestamp, that's something you can drop into your database. I think this is a pretty useful one. Notice this is one of those that we leave empty. So like the moment an entry goes into your database, you can timestamp it. This is one that is commonly used. We don't have any homework examples of this, but I like to make you aware of it. So for example, have the imagination that somebody's on your website, they fill out a form, they hit submit, your code processes it, and the moment it hits the database, you drop in a timestamp, and you can see when the user signed up, the day, time, minute, second, the whole bit, right? And I think that's very, very useful. As you look through some of the stuff here, look at all the different like date and time things that you can kind of extract here. We don't do a lot of examples in our homework, so not really a lot of reason to cover it. Some of this stuff we've tinkered with a little bit. Once again, special use case scenarios. But like if you were doing something in a database where you needed one of these, you would come and look it up, figure out how it works, and see how it could help your process. Real frankly, with a lot of the functions that you have that you put inside of code, you have different types of scenarios for handling some of these things. So like, I'm a big believer, like when I write code that sends stuff to a database, that I handle a lot of the mechanics in the programming code and not in the database. The reason this stuff exists on a database level is sometimes you don't have that control and the data comes in at you in a raw fashion. And all of these functions give you ways to manipulate the data to create new columns or whatever. So you can look at the data in a different way if the raw form of it is not useful, frankly. Also, if the data in your database needs to then be put back up on the screen, like I think like for example, like having like the name of a month, like for example, like January 3rd or something like that. If you can take like a numeric data out of your database and convert it into that so you can put it back up on the screen for somebody, that might actually be kind of useful, right? And have some good utility. All right, there is another category of these functions here, which they call advanced functions, none of which I think we're going to use here, but I'm going to kind of scroll through some of them so you can see. Some of them have some pretty high level functions that they use. Some that you might use, and I'm going to highlight some of those. For example, what current user is on the database, maybe not super relevant, but one you might use. We've used the cast function a couple of times where we can take one data type and turn it into something else so that we can do other things with it. For example, text that comes in from the user, it's stored as you're storing a number, but it's text, and then you need to do math with it, so you have to cast it. And this is kind of an interesting one, database. They have a function that tells you what database you're using. Hey, that's kind of cool, right? If you don't know. Here's another one that we've played with, if statement. I am going to go into that, all right, because we've used this before. And the way that the if statement basically works is we have some sort of a statement, right? And in this case, we're hard coding numbers, but often we might take like, I don't know, order amount versus total amount and come up with like a true false value. And if the value is true, we do this. And if the value is false, we do that, right? And this is a very simplistic example, but we have played with this a little bit, right? So we've seen that one in action already. Here's one that we sometimes run, for example, and these are kind of useful too, like you're checking a field to see if it's null, and if it's null, then you put a different kind of response in. Other ones you may use as well, and these are kind of interesting. I look at all the ones here at the bottom, where you might look at like who your users are. You might look at what version of MySQL you're running. And I think that's kind of an interesting one because that's a really common command for web programmers, by the way. Like if you're working on a database and you don't have root access to the database, but you can somehow inject, like write a web application that pulls back the version number of your database, so you know what code you're working with. So when you're sending code to the database, you send it in the correct version, right? Because different versions can have different syntaxes. All right. That's kind of the three big categories they talk about at W3 Schools, by the way. As we switch over to MySQL tutorial, they do have a whole section, and I apologize here, I thought I had it loaded up, talking about all the different functions and all the different categories. They do start to talk about this concept called regular expression. So I'm going to kind of mention this. I don't want to spend like a huge amount of time on it, but regular expressions are this approach basically for putting up patterns for data before they go into an application and or a database. Okay, so here comes the question. Why would you do that? Okay, so for example, if I set up a column in a database to hold a zip code, right? And I'm assuming it's in a, let's say, United States zip code that typically only will have numbers, right? How many numbers what capacity do I set that up for? Well, some of you will just say, well, 5. Or then some of you go, no, 9. This actually, they got like zip plus 4. I don't know if you guys know that, right? Like, um, and and of course, if you go to like Canada or something, then they allow letters in there, but whatever, right? So the point is that you can set up a pattern so that when the data is on the inbound, it will check that data to see if it fits the format. Now, interestingly, okay, this makes a lot of sense for a database because databases are strongly typed, right? So I can't just throw any information into a database column. It has to be the right data type. Typically, the same is true with programming. Of course, Python is an exception, right? We always say that because it'll take pretty much any data. Um, However, we also use regular expressions, not here, just here in MySQL, but it is like it's kind of a universal language for masking input for just about every programming language. And if you go out and you want to study this as a topic, I'm just going to do an example here, like regular expressions, and I don't want the MySQL one. And you just Google it, right? You'll notice that they have this whole thing about it. In fact, you can buy books, and I tell my students you can buy books that are 3 inches thick that cover all the different variants of regular expressions, and it's kind of crazy um, that it really goes that deep. The concept originated back in the 50s. You know, this guy came up with this idea, but the point is they have this like weird syntax that kind of looks like this, right? That allows you to declare what your incoming data should look like. Um, and they have all these different characters you can use, and I'm sure they have examples, and they have like the whole kind of thing about it. Was what I was hoping for were some basic examples, and this is probably where I should be using an AI to say, hey, give me some basic examples of regular expressions. But okay, so these are actually some basic ones here, right? So if you were just looking for letters and numbers, right? You write an expression that would say all the capital letters, all the lowercase letters, all the numbers, those are allowed, right? Etc. And they have formats for this, right? And it gets very, very, very granular for a lot of different reasons. Um, and once again, this is a universal. So like if you go to the Java programming language or C Sharp or JavaScript or HTML or Python or SQL or MySQL or whatever, they all use this language. It's really weird, right? But it is useful, it is universal, and MySQL does support it. Um, and I'm just going to kind of go to a couple of the examples here because we're going to do a couple little goofing around with it. And I'm going to give you the syntax for this, so don't worry about trying to memorize this stuff. We're just going to play with it a little bit. I want you to be aware that it's there. And we'll look at the fundamental approach here. So basically, you're going to have some sort of an expression and then the pattern that you want it to fit. So for example, if we're doing, yeah, I'm not really worried about that right now. A select statement, and then we run a regular expression after it, it's forcing it into some format. Okay, so like without knowing the syntax, we have no idea what that means. But they're telling us up above. It says, the following example uses the regular expression operator to check if a string contains any digits. And the syntax for that is this, right? 2 forward slashes, the letter D, and a plus sign. So if there's any numbers in that, that will return true, right? And look at the output. The output is 1, which stands for true, right? And so this is kind of how weird it gets. So, you know, the thing is, it can also look around formatting. So this one would look for a digit, and then followed by a period, and then another digit. So are we finding that pattern? The pattern is yes, we're finding that pattern. Right? So you can kind of sort of see the utility of this, right? A little bit, hopefully. All right, and they go through example after example. This is just with digits that they're doing the example here, but that's just one of the basic One that we will use during the homework, we will use this one, which is to look for a substring. Um, so in other words, we're going to look for a substring that matches whatever string we're pulling up on the screen. Um, and then, notice that we have all these different parameters that we can throw in. So like what string we're looking for, the pattern it fits into, what position it's in, how many occurrences there are, and what kind of match it is. And they explain all of it here in detail. I have some sample code, so all you have to do is follow along with me and you'll be fine. But they kind of get pretty deep here, right? And once again, they're focusing on digits here. They're not doing a lot with text. Um, yeah, but in other words, it's going to be useful to us. We are going to be looking for text, and I will show you how that operates. The other one that we're going to play with a little bit is this one here. That's going to return the starting index of a substring that matches the regular expression. And so once again, the syntax is somewhat similar. Let's see if they can find an example here. Right. And here we're looking for the position of where the digits start. And I don't know why they keep hammering on digits and not other things, but this is what they decided to do. All right. I think we're pretty good on this as far as lecture stuff goes. The rest of the stuff that we're going to do by virtue of coding through the homework. We've been on the topic here for a while. Let's terminate this lecture video here.